So welcome everyone to our webinar. Today we're going to be talking about importing data and connecting data sets. This is intended to be an overview of basic methods, but also get into some of the more sophisticated things that DataGraph does. And one of the reasons I think this is important in terms of foundationally how we use DataGraph and the techniques that are in the program is that we spend a lot of time preparing data. One of the numbers that I've seen thrown around, I'm sure some of you have heard this as well, is that 80% of a data scientist's or analyst's time is spent moving data around and preparing data. We're sort of impatient people and don't think that that is a good use of time. And a lot of the methods that we're going to talk about are really all intended on making things easier for you in order to be able to save time and not have to spend 80% of your time doing the data preparation. So first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Pamela Schultz, and I am going to be your host for this webinar, as well as the next 3 webinars that are in this series, going from importing data to exporting data that we'll be doing throughout the month of June. And what I want to do to start today, let me go ahead and first share my screen. We're going to start with the basics. Let's just talk about, first of all, what types of files can you import? DataGraph has a number of different file types that you can bring into the program. Text files, Excel files, you can bring in MATLAB data, .mat files. They do have to have the version 4 flag associated with them. They changed the format slightly. I've never had a problem with this with my own data coming from MATLAB into DataGraph. NetCDF is a file format that DataGraph understands. There's a plot program that we've had some requests to be able to use those files, so you can import that. And good old Cricket Graph, for those of you who had used Cricket Graph, that's another file format that DataGraph should be able to understand. And we will talk about this in more detail, but in general, one of the things you'll notice with DataGraph is that when you go to import a file, in the file manager, you won't see certain file types grayed out. So we don't make an automatic assumption about a file type based on the file extension as to what you can import and what you can't import. So just be aware of that. You can try and import any type of file, and if it's a text-based file format that we can understand, it will import it regardless of what the extension is. A couple of things that are in the pipeline for DataGraph. One of them is that we have a JSON importer. This is in the current beta. Connecting to our output is another thing. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, actually, when we talk about statistics and curve fitting in DataGraph. There's also some ability in the beta to connect to databases. I use this myself. It can be very handy for monitoring databases that are online. So if you have that need or are interested in that, just want you to know that that is in the beta, something that we're working on. And now let's get more into importing data. So first of all, when you're importing data into DataGraph, what happens? You know, what are the things that DataGraph does? And initially there are default settings that are going to be used, and the whole pipeline that DataGraph that we're going to show you goes from very simple techniques to importing data to doing things more and more complicated. But when you're using the default methods within DataGraph, there's really 3 things that are happening. One is that we're trying to detect a header row. We're trying to determine what the column separator is, and DataGraph, I should say, is trying to also determine what the column type is. Those are really the 3 main things that the default importer will do. And as we go through the more and more sophisticated ways to import data, you'll have more and more control over each of these aspects. Now, so this gets back to this idea. We have the default logic. I'm going to show you how to override that logic, and then we're going to talk about how you specify the exact logic that's used in importing files into your DataGraph file. And what I want to do now is actually just go through sort of from the beginning to the end, the default logic to how we specify the logic, just talk about those methods briefly, and then we'll go and start to show you some examples of each of these throughout the webinar. But I really want to just, again, hit the highlights first so you can see where we're going with this. So first of all, there's just the simple action of importing a file into DataGraph. This is something that is going to use the default logic. There's a shortcut for doing this that's shown on your screen, Shift-Command-I. And again, this is just going to use the default logic. When you do import file, you'd have no control over what the header is or what the column type is. Also, if you do drag and drop, this is another way of using the default logic. You can do some specification here when you are selecting rows where you want to append data, or selecting columns that you want to replace, or you can drop on a group to replace the entire group. I'll show you how you do that. And one thing to be aware of is that as you use the drag and drop interface, you may see a screen like this pop up on DataGraph. I've seen this pop up on people and then wonder, okay, why am I seeing this screen? We have added down below an answer to that question. Why am I seeing this screen? Well, you will see this screen when DataGraph is not entirely sure which data you're appending belongs to a particular column, and it will allow you to specify that. So you can override or customize or specify really where the data is going. Again, this is just for appending data. Well, I'll show you an example of that. But what do we do also when the default options don't work? And this is where we get into more specificity that we will talk about, and I will show you some examples of. First of all, there's a find and replace in DataGraph. Again, here's the shortcut for that, Shift-Command-R. You can use this to replace particular aspects of data. And one of the things that we tried really hard within DataGraph, kind of the philosophy of the program, is that as you make those changes, you will have a visual interface that shows you what the changes are going to look like when you actually make those changes. So this is something that is, I think, really kind of unique to DataGraph. And I will show you this, but again, each of these options to get more specific and to have more control will have a visual interface for making those changes before you make them. Copy and paste is the same way. If you're doing a simple copy paste, it may use the default option and not ask you any questions about where the data goes. But again, if it's unsure, then you may see this pop up again, where it's going to ask you where the data is going to. For the find and replace, this is the interface that you see for find and replace. It gives you, oh, actually, sorry, this is the interface for, oh no, this is the interface for find and replace. This is also the paste special interface where you, actually, I guess I got some of my slides out of order here. This is the paste special interface. We can, hopefully you can see this one. Here we go. So these two interfaces actually are very similar. So here is what you see when you're doing find and replace. Sorry, just to make that clear. The other technique here is the paste special interface, which is, again, this is only when you need more specificity. If you paste special, which is not just Command V, but Shift Command V, here is the interface that you will see. And this gives you so what we've shown so far, this gives you the most control over how things are pasted in or how things are imported. You can click to transpose the data. You can change what the separator is for determining how the columns are separated. And then there's some other common types of data processing that you might want to use in terms of changing the numbers, removing extra spaces, removing non-numbers. Those are all things that you can do within the paste special interface. Now, in the last category here, again, is where we get into things that are much more specific, where you can really go ahead and specify everything that DataGraph is doing in terms of importing a file. Actually, the first option I'm showing here is just You'll see this, the import file portion or import Excel sheet. These are actually sort of the simple methods, but can get you to that more sophisticated method, which is the import special method. This is Option Command I is the shortcut to get this. And import special will really give you all the customization that you need in order to import data. And this is where we're going to go through this webinar. We're going to go through each of these options and show you some examples of this. Okay, there's a question on Cricket Graph, a question about does DataGraph recognize Cricket Graph files that were generated with Mac OS 9? I believe it should. If you're having trouble with that, definitely let us know. Our intention is to be able to get that to work. So as far as I know, that should work. But get back, if it doesn't, let us know. Okay. So now that we've just hit the highlights of what we're going to talk about, here's the file that I was actually working through. Again, this is the presentation mode in DataGraph. I was just showing you this information in as a presentation. Now we're going to go through from the simple import to the import special to show you some of these examples. And what we're also going to do is talk a little bit about connecting data sets. Another question, what about KaleidGraph? I have lots of data in KaleidGraph. This is actually a good question. We were talking about this the other day and the possibility of us coming up with a parser that would allow you to bring KaleidGraph files in. If you want to contact us on the help email, if you have specific files that you want to send us, that might be helpful. But we have looked at this format and it does look like one that we could create a parser for. So if that's of interest to you, then definitely contact us on the help email. And again, the more people that ask for it, then the more likely it is that we'll be able to spend the time. Okay, looks like we've got more interest in KaleidGraph, so that's great. That's really good to know. Okay, excellent. So the first thing here in terms of import file, if you go under actually we'll start under the data menu, there are several options that you'll see here, and the top one is this import file option. Again, it's going to use the default logic. The import options are also available from the gear menu on your data table. This is just to make it quicker to be able to quickly import files. If I choose this, and I'm going to go to my desktop where I have some example files, I'll just click this CSV file and open it, and you can see here this imported very easily. Not a difficult one to bring in, but again, very simple. And there's another question about VCF files. That's a file format I'm actually not familiar with. We'll have to look into that one. I'm not familiar with VCF files, so we'll have to check on that. But the other thing that we're going to actually talk about is the fact that you can create your own custom parser for files. And that's where actually this is a very powerful functionality. So again, starting now with really the basics, but the import special allows you to create your own parser that will bring your data in, assuming that it's a text file that can be understood. So that is a really powerful functionality that we'll talk about. But keep that in mind for depending on what the file type is, that might also be an option for you. So here's our simple import file, no problem. This was an easy file to import. Next, I want to talk about dragging and dropping, because there are some things to realize about dragging and dropping the files, just in case you've never even done this before, depending on how you've brought files into DataGraph. Here are my files on my desktop, and the first thing would be if I want to just import all of this data into DataGraph, I can drag it and drop it onto the data table, and it basically does the same thing as the import file. It just imports it using the default parser. Now, another thing you can do is you can drag and drop a file onto the column list. And when you do that, you get a group created around the data. Again, just in case you've never tried that before, very easy to do. And you can do this with not just one file, but I could take multiple files. So for example, here I have a bunch of CSV files. I also have an Excel file. I could highlight all these files at once, drag them and drop them onto my column list, and each file will be imported as a group. I actually repeated that twice with my mouse, so you see them shown there twice, but each file is imported as a group. Delete that. Very quick to do. So one of the things that the import method is generally pretty fast. Most data, even pretty large files, will import really quickly into DataGraph. So here you can see all these different files that I imported. Any type of file that works within DataGraph will work in the drag and drop. For example, here I have a net CDF file as an example. Let me just pull this file in. I'm going to take this file, drag it and drop it, and that now has also been included in my data table. So all these files, anyone that is recognized, can be imported in as a drag and drop. Okay, and I'm just going to, I think I've answered these questions. There was another question, this may have been repeated. Does it support VCF files? And again, I'm going to have to check into that one. I'm not sure about that. So, so you've seen how we can simply drag and drop. We can drag and drop to create groups. If you haven't really used groups before and you're not familiar with DataGraph, you can also group objects, data objects, by highlighting them. Add the group icon here. You can also undo that, but groups are really the way that we organize our data. So for example, the Excel file that I dragged and dropped in here, what DataGraph does is it actually takes the tabs within Excel and makes those separate groups. And then I can see each column as a separate entity within my group that I've imported. Okay, and if I just delete that. So the other thing I want to talk to you about in terms of drag and drop, not just how you, again, it's very easy just to drag the files in. So far, all the files we've done have been formatted well, so they're easy for us to bring in. But if you're doing some appending data, or you want to replace data, then you can also drag and drop in order to be able to bring in the data. And the question, can MAC numbers files also be dropped? You know, that's something we actually don't have right now. So the question about number files from data that's in numbers being dragged and dropped, we really should have that, because that is obviously on the Mac platform. That's another thing that we're looking at adding. So just to be aware of that. It's currently just the Excel spreadsheets that can come in. So you would have to actually go from numbers to Excel to get into DataGraph, which again, maybe is a little bit more of a workaround than we should have. So another one that we should pay attention to. So let's go ahead and let me show you just a couple of things here in terms of this being able to change the data as we drag and drop. So here I have a really simple file. I'm going to go ahead and drag this, drop it onto the data table, and I can see my group of data. And I'll actually go ahead and let me add in a new graph window here so you can see this. Now, I guess for my sheet, I have a margin here that's maybe a little bit wider. All right, well, I won't worry about that for right now. I just want to show you what happens with this data. If I make a bar chart, for example, with the data that I dragged in, and I have this in a group, so I could have done this to begin with. Here's my data file that I've dragged in. I've put it in a group. What if I want to add data to these columns? So here I have a CSV file that if you click on it, you'll see that there's two columns in here, apples and bananas. If I want to append to this data set, then the way to do this in DataGraph is to click on the row where you want to append data into, and you could do copy paste, or you could drag and drop this file onto the data table. And this is where you get that interface that pops up that is asking you to specify where do you want this data to be located. And this is interactive, so I can change. If I have my column for bananas and I wanted to go into oranges, I could do that. The logic that actually popped up is correct. We want apples to go into apples. We want bananas to go into bananas. If you, if the columns that you're appending have titles that don't match or it's unclear, then this window will pop up and there'll be no connections shown, and you would have to drag to connect where you want them to go. Like that, for example. There's also, notice, a gear menu here that has some shortcuts. If the connections are wrong, you can remove all of them. If you want to connect by column name, you can do that and have it connect for you. So this is something that I would recommend, just exploring a little bit what the gear menu does. This can, be a quick way to bring in the data. And one thing that we try and do also is once you've specified a particular logic, if I did the same action again, that window wouldn't pop up again because it would know where things are going. It sort of assumes that you want to do the same thing. So you would see the same, you would see that result already. Okay, another thing I want to show you, and then I'll check our Q&A board, is to look at how would I update this data? This is something, when we're bringing data in, it's not always just to bring in a brand new file. We sometimes want to update the entire data set that we have. And by grouping our data, you can make it really easy to update the whole thing. So here I have, for example, a CSV file that has different data in it, and I want to just replace all of the data that's in this group. Instead of copying and pasting into these columns, I can actually just take this file, and if you look at the bar graphs, you'll see how the data changes when I take it and I drag it and I drop it onto that group. It's updated all the data that's in the group. Again, the column names were exactly the same, so it knew where to put the data. So it was easy for it to follow that logic. I find that to be really handy. And one of the reasons why I often recommend to people when you're creating graphs in DataGraph to really try and keep the data you're importing in its own group, because if you do have to update it, then it's just a matter of a drag and drop onto that group to be able to update the session. Update the file. Okay, let me check on a couple of these questions. So the first one, can you not simply import an Excel file, but link DataGraph file to Excel so that when the Excel file is changed, the DataGraph would update automatically? We have not done that at this point. That's something that, again, if there's a, if people feel like that there's a real need for that, that might be something that we would think about doing. There is a mechanism for us to have that sort of functionality that we've already been developing. This is a functionality that we're actually using in our DataGraph R package. So if you're an R user, we have currently on the CRAN website where you can get different packages into the R statistical program. There is a DataGraph package. This is in the beta for DataGraph, but it allows you to run R scripts, and DataGraph will monitor those files, and anytime they change, then you'll see that happen in DataGraph. So this is something that I think could also be done in Excel. We haven't done it yet. That's just, this is an interesting comment. Migrating from Cricket Graph to Kaleidograph to DataGraph seems to be a common path. And of course, we love people to get into our DataGraph fold. So that's kind of interesting. And again, sort of supports that idea of adding in the Kaleidograph as one of the things that we do. Just a quick comment about the webinar. the comment Zoom session might be paused and hesitating for some people. Hopefully that won't be a problem. We are recording all these sessions so you can get it later on YouTube. And in terms of showing functionality that DataGraph offers that Excel doesn't, here we're really focusing on the importing, and without a doubt, I think the parser that you'll see is something that you don't have that kind of functionality in Excel. And you can go to other, we'll do other webinars that are more basic where you'll see more options in terms of how is DataGraph different from Excel. I'd also recommend checking out our YouTube channel because we have some videos there, particularly the Getting the Most Out of DataGraph session that we started, or videos we've started, have a lot of information on that. And let me actually, before so I don't just continue to answer questions, let me go ahead and continue to go through some of these options here. So we've talked about dragging and dropping and appending. Also, if you select columns and you take a file and you drag and drop with the columns selected, then you replace those columns completely. So another way to use drag and drop, just to be aware of how that works. We've talked about replacing, appending, and dragging onto groups. And we've shown you this interface. So what do we do when the default options don't work? Because that's really when things get more interesting, right? When we realize that we have our data, but we're unable to get it in the format we need in terms of the default options. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just quickly demonstrate how find and replace works, because that's, again, one of the ways that you can deal with data being brought in that you want to change in some way. So I'm going to go and use this file here. We're going to use this in a couple of different ways, but this is a very simple file just to illustrate how this works. And if I drag this file and drop it onto the data table, I've brought in file in this text format that has 3 different sections in it. It has a section that's showing me the date for this information, and it has a part number, and it also has some values associated with it. This, in this format, isn't something I could really plot. I need to distill this into the more basic table. So one thing we can do is do Shift Command R. This gives us the find and replace window. Actually, I didn't highlight the data to do the find and replace on, which is why you don't see anything. So let me just cancel this, highlight my column. Now I'll do Shift Command R. You see the column that I've selected. And if I tell it to find and replace something, we're going to see a preview of exactly what that is. So as I'm typing in date and then space, you'll see how the column shown is giving me a preview of exactly what that's going to look like when I do this action. Again, trying to show you what happens before it actually happens. Then I can click change, and that change has been done. DataGraph has unlimited undo since the last time you saved. So you can undo it, but the idea is to not have to undo, to make sure that the change is what you want. Now for something like this, I want a column that has dates in it. I'm going to show you some other ways to do this that are a little bit more sophisticated, but just so you can see how this works. Again, some of these manipulations we can do within the data table before we even get into some of the more sophisticated approaches. So right here I have this column report name, and I want to separate the data on the part from the date column itself. The way that I would go about doing this is to make a copy of this column. I use the clone functionality all the time, hold down the Option key, click the column, drag it, and we get the plus symbol that shows you an exact copy of this column. And in one of these columns, I'm going to want to keep just the dates in there. So for example, I can do another find and replace where I remove the part data, for example. Oops, There we go. I could change that. I could also highlight rows of data and just delete them. Now it's going to ask me where to delete them. I think I'll just cancel that. We can take the data that we have and we can, do a number of different things. I wanted to show you, I don't want to get too caught up in this. Because I have the data separated, as you see here, I can do a filling in of the data based on the row that's the topmost row. So this is a functionality that I have found very useful because a lot of times, especially if you're bringing spreadsheets in, spreadsheets will tend to be formatted more for presentation rather than data analysis. So if you're looking at data like this, I want, again, my date to be filled into these rows so that DataGraph will know what date these are associated with. So in this text column, I can do a control click or right click, and there's an option for fill empty rows with previous non-empty row. If I select that, then you'll see how it filled in this row with all of the dates. When you use that functionality, you have to use it when the column is in a text data type. This is another thing that you can easily change. Again, DataGraph will try and interpret what the appropriate data type is. If you have the wrong data type, you can right click and convert to the data type you want this to be. We'll now convert this to a date. And DataGraph has a lot of functionality built in to try and make sure that it interprets dates appropriately. You can also specify format strings for exactly how dates should be interpreted. I'm not going to go through that in this webinar, but just be aware that that functionality exists. And if you go to our website, for example, you can see that. So now for this data, I would want to do a couple of other things quickly. I might want to select all the empty rows, for example, and then I can just hit delete and get rid of those. I could also select individual rows by holding down the command key and again, hit the delete. And now I have a table that is much more appropriate in terms of being able to import the data. Okay, so just doing a quick time check. Let me see if I can answer a couple of questions. And a question about the automatic update of graphs built on other formats. That's something that we definitely, we could think about this with the, again, connecting to different data sets. Origin, oh, there's another one, an Origin user. Is it possible to import Origin lab files? I don't know that we have really looked at Origin as much as Kaleidograph because that's come up, but that's something we could try and see. Can we plot a 3D graph through DataGraph? That's something that, again, I don't want to get into that into too much detail since I want to make sure I get through everything I'd like to talk about this morning. But I will say that DataGraph does not do 3D in terms of, say, 3D bar charts or that kind of a faux 3D. There's a lot of potential for actually misrepresenting data when using those. I know some people really like them. We have avoided that type of graph. We do have a scalar field command that's in the beta that will allow you to represent surfaces. And we have other programs that do 3D imagery of image files, that depending on what you're looking for. So just to be aware of that. And there's a question about keeping the imported data in its original format so it can be easily updated. Is there a way to keep a secondary manipulated data sets of data that link or draw information directly from the imported group? Yes, if I understand this question correctly about linking to data from an imported group, I think that the functionality you might be looking for would be in the redirect column. So if you look at the other drop-down menu, there's a column type called redirect. This was actually something that a user had requested, where you would be able to say, for example, I added this redirect column here. If I wanted to take the data from report name, I could, oops, didn't quite add the way that I wanted to there. I dragged and dropped that column. So now I have this column called report name, and I've redirected it into a new column that I could call anything I wanted. That could be just one individual letter, but it's just redirecting that data into that one column. Then I could place this in another entire group. And if I kept my imported data, so this would be my imported data, I could hide that, and then I think that would work as you're hoping, that you would have this column that is then just, it's pulling that data that you've imported, but then I can use that in other equations and places throughout my file, but keep, again, the imported data separate. Now you do have to do a redirect for every column that you would want to do that for. Again, if I would do this for more than one column, I would click and drag, make a clone, pick another column that I would do my redirect on. So it can be pretty quick to create them, even if you have multiple to create. And let's see, another question, the find and replace button, you'd like another button on that, change and remain open, so that more changes can be made. I guess I'd have to check into that to see exactly how that would work. I have to think about that one a little bit. And another question, are we going to have Python for use in our own programming? That's actually something I know a number of people have been interested in Python. It's a little tricky with DataGraph because of the way that the program is built to actually have scripting throughout it. In our program image tank that we're working on, that is going to have Python scripting in it. You can do scriptability with DataGraph. So there is a way to call DataGraph from the command line, so you can incorporate it into scripting. That's something that we've talked about actually doing for a future webinar. So that also could be part of the answer to that, just to be aware that that's in there. If you go into our manual and go into the appendix section, you can find some information on scripting with DataGraph. Okay, and there is a question about merging or joining data sets based on variables. We're going to talk about that actually as we get through this these different functionalities here, because that is part of what we want to do, is show you how to connect variables. Okay, so let me go ahead and get rid of this example here, and we'll move on to some more sophisticated things. So we talked about this window. Copy paste, I'm not really going to go through this, just because it's fairly simple, but just again, yes, you can copy paste from other programs. So when you want a section of data, you can copy and paste that in. The paste special interface, again, this is another interface that comes up when you're bringing things into DataGraph. I actually want to make sure, in the interest of time, that I get into some of the more sophisticated examples with the import special. So I'm not going to go through this into too much detail. You can go ahead and play with this a little bit. If you're looking for where do you find this, then when you're pasting, I don't have anything in my clipboard right now, but you can find it under the edit menu, paste special, or again, you can use the shortcut that you see here, Shift Command V, in order to use this interface, which again, it just gives you another level of specification. I often find sometimes actually I even use paste special just from within the program itself. If I'm taking a column and I want to manipulate it, put it in a different column, paste special can be sort of helpful for that. Okay, so let's move on to, again, kind of the more advanced functionality that we have. And I guess first, just to round this out, if you go into this menu, you'll see import file portion. We have this import Excel sheet under the data menu also. That actually somewhat of an oversight that it's not also in this menu. but you don't need that import Excel sheet importer. That's kind of another custom importer. It allows you to open Excel sheets without having Excel on your computer. It allows you to select sections of an Excel sheet. So the import file portion is essentially allowing you to import a portion of a text file. Import Excel sheet is allowing you to import a portion of an Excel sheet. Again, I'm not going to go through those. It's not necessarily that sophisticated. To be honest, when I import from Excel, I pretty much almost always drag and drop, and then I do my data manipulations from within DataGraph. So it's rare for me anyway that I'm going into an Excel sheet and pulling out a section. I find it easier to just do that within DataGraph. So what I want to show you is this import special interface, because this really in and of itself is like its own program within DataGraph. It's a way to parse data and to be able to create a custom parser for a data set. I'm going to do this first with our really simple file that we have. Again, this is this records file. If you go onto the DataGraph knowledge base, actually there is a whole section on importing files that it's probably worth pointing that one out to you. I think I have, yeah, let me just show you this very quickly. If you go into the knowledge base, and some of you, I know we have a lot of people on the line, depending on how often you go to our website, you may not have even seen this yet. This is our whole new help system. If you go under here, under articles or knowledge base, there's how-to tutorials, and there's one section with articles on importing data. We're still adding information to this website, but there is a lot in here, and the import special method has 3 different examples that you can go through to see how it works. I'm going to show you the example 2 that's on the website and just walk you through that one here. So import special is something I can get through my gear menu. And if I pick, when I select import special, the first thing that you do have to do is pick a file that you want to import. And if I select my records text, and then I select open, this interface pops up where I know there's a lot on this, this interface right now. This is actually one that I've already created. I'll create this from scratch as well, but just so you see what we're going for here. The first thing is that you have a list of instructions. This is over here on the right-hand side. That was I just got it. Someone's playing with the fill functionality and thought that it was very useful. So I'm glad that that's helpful. Okay, so you'll see the number of a number of these commands here. Again, this might look a little overwhelming at first, but we'll break this down for you. This is where you're specifying how to parse this data. What you see in this part of the screen is the actual data file that I'm parsing, and the highlighted pieces of the file are showing you what's being imported. And then below, you're seeing a preview of exactly what is going to import. So again, this is allowing you to specify the command, specify how this works. You get a preview both in terms of the text file itself, and you get a preview of what's going to happen when I hit import. So for example, here I hit import, the data was brought in. Okay, let me show you now how to bring this in, just do this from scratch. So I'm going to do a new file, and I haven't saved this parser, so that's another thing you can do. But just so you know, we're going to do this now completely from scratch. I'll do import special. I'm going to select my simple file here. And now, because I haven't saved the parser that I created, I'm doing this all from scratch. You see the preview of the file itself, and then my menu over on the right-hand side. Now there's not as much here because This is where I actually create the specifications for how I'm going to parse this data. And you'll notice there's a number of sections. There's a header definition, stop parsing when. This allows you to just have it start going through the file. You can create subheaders. That's something we're going to do with this file, because again, we have these subsections. We want the date itself to be its own column. And then we define the records as to how we bring this in. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start this by, first of all, if you click on within the record definitions, these buttons should look somewhat familiar, because this is how buttons that we also use to create columns within DataGraph. So if I click on the number, for example, then you'll see that the beginnings of these lines are identified, and it's going all the way till there's some kind of end of line to say that's what I'm going to be importing. And if I, again, bring up my list down below, you'll see, or my window down below, we'll see these highlighted sections that are showing you what it's going to look like when I bring it in. But this is all red because this is, I selected this as a number column, but this is all text. So it's very similar to actually some of the conventions that are used within DataGraph itself, that if it's numbers, it will, if it's a text that's in a number column, it will show up as red. Okay. So if I want to change my type of column, I can actually use the gear menu here. I could change this to text or change it back to a number column, or I can just click another column and add that in. So you can see here now 2 columns that I've selected, and I can do other things here. I can go ahead and say that I want to skip my first couple of lines. I don't need to bring in the report name, for example. That's part of what I would skip. So I can say skip the first 2 lines, don't import that. This is getting now closer to what I want this to look like. I also want to create this subheader. So to do that, I would say in this section for subheader, let's identify where the subheader starts. So I'll say line starts with, and I can type in the word date, colon, and now it knows that these are my subheader lines. I also have to then define what's in the subheader. So I haven't done that. I can say that I have, again, I want to skip over a section. So I'm going to skip the first, let's see, maybe 5 characters. And then I'm going to say that there's a date column here. And you can see how now there's another column added where it's using the date as my subheader. Now, for this one, I don't want to include the part number. I actually want this just to be the part. So within my record definition, I could also say, skip over, move this to the top. So you can move all of these selectors around, skip the first, oops, 5, not 5 lines, 5 characters, and then you have the numbers being imported. So those may be a little fast, but it really worth, if you want to create importers, you want to parse your data specifically, this is really, really a very powerful functionality to specify exactly how it works. You can also add masking. Another way to use then the import special would be, say you have some really massive files that, you know, DataGraph doesn't have a limit in terms of how much data you can bring in, but at some point there is a limit to what you can do just because of the machine itself. So I think right now you can probably comfortably go up to about 20 million rows of data. But if you have a file that exceeds that and you only want to pull out specific pieces of data from that, then you can do that by creating an import method, and then you would have a mask, a filter within the import method itself to say only bring in lines that have a particular value. So for example, here, if my second line here is the part, for example, I could say that down below, this is my masking. I could say where think this, no, maybe that doesn't let me drag and drop that. It's a lot of dragging and dropping, but not right there. So I could say where part is equal to 1, those are the only lines or rows that I want to import. And you'll notice how, again, this visually is showing me that I can only import, or I'm only going to import the lines where part is equal to 1. A couple of other things to realize about this import special before I'll try and answer as many questions as I can get to. If you want to import not from one file, but from multiple files, then you can add files here. So that there's a gear menu down below where you can select more files into the import process. Or when you're actually selecting the files to import, you can select a group of files all at once, and you'll be able to get a preview of those different files using this drop-down menu. Notice how by default, you'll see a preview line count of 100. This is, again, to make sure that we don't overtax the system initially in case you have huge files, but you can easily increase this to make this higher. Here I have a small file, so it doesn't really matter, but if you want to see a bigger portion previewed of the file, you can change that there. You can include the record number as when in the import. If you're doing multiple files, you can also include the file name as a column. Now, that actually isn't in the preview. You do have to just click this. I have found this really useful for work that I've done where I've had to import, dozens of files that all have the same format. And as long as I check this include file name as column, then I know where all that data is coming from. And there's a couple of other options here. So I'm going to just go ahead now just to illustrate, say import, and you can see how this data was imported. Let me go ahead and check our time. We're getting close to the end. So how do you save these once it's all set up? That's actually the last question. Let me talk about that really quickly. I do want to make sure I show this joining functionality as well. But once you have a parser set up, if I'm going ahead and I want to keep this parser to use in other files, let me go back to my import special functionality. And again, I'm going to select the same file. And because in this file, it's going to remember that this was a file I've already imported. It's going to show me the same method by default that I've created. But I may want to use this same import method for other files. So to do that, here on the left-hand side, we haven't really talked about what this part of the parser does. This is where you can save a version of this importer to use in other files. This is also where we can set up an extension, file extension to, again, create a parser that will work automatically for files with a particular name extension. So here, let's just call this, just call it data, just to be simple. And I want to, I'm going to show you also how to create this extension. So if I say that if I have a file with the extension RCD, then it should always use this parser to import that data. Now, right now, this is in the local section, but if I want every file I have to use this same parser, not just the file I'm in, or maybe you want to create a parser and you want to share it with someone else, these also will be shared. It will stay with the file. But I could say, add new entry. This is really adding it, copy into the global list. That's what I want to do here. Now that brings the parser, but I do still here have to specify the extension. So you can see the file extensions are here. There's another one here I had created before for files with the extension AGR. But for now, I have this parser, and anytime I have a file with the extension RCD, if I can import, actually you don't even need to do that. I had these rows highlighted, so it put it in that location. But now if I go to this file that I created here, this is records.txt. I'm going to change this file extension to RCD. my computer is going to complain a little bit. Do you really want to change the extension? Yes, I do. Now, if I say a new DataGraph file, I don't have to go through the parser again. I can just take this file and drag it and drop it into DataGraph, and notice how it parsed it in exactly the way that I had specified. I just think this is very cool. And again, a way to really create a custom parser for a type of file that you have to deal with that has text data in it. Okay, let me see if I can check these questions that we have here. Okay, great. I'm glad that that was helpful. Okay, so I don't want to forget this. Connecting data sets. We're definitely reaching the end of our time, and this is a really important functionality that DataGraph has. So for example, here, I have this data that, let's say this is my records, and there's a part number that I have where each of these is part number 1. But I have another table that I set up here that has a type associated with different part numbers. Actually, since I parsed this so heavily, there's not other part numbers in here. Let me just create some data quickly that shows you how this would work. Okay, so I have my data table, I have my part number, I have some value here, and I'm going to bring in now this new table. This is again a simple format. I can just bring it and drag it and drop it here. Now you see 2 different tables where I have a column with the same name. And this is what we want to map together. In my records table, I want a column that's going to tell me what type of part that I have. Really easy to do. As long as the column names are exactly the same, what we do in DataGraph is if you click under the gear menu, you will see an option for map. And DataGraph will automatically pick up every other group in your file that has a column with the same name, and it will give you an option for what column do you want to pick that you want to map and connect these data sets with. If I pick the column type, notice how it creates this column that is pulling for part number 1, part number 6, and part number 3, what the type of part I have there. So really, as long as these are, again, the same name, this is very handy. If you have a table on countries with population that you want to connect with another data set that has country data, with some numerical values, you want to connect those. Again, you click on the gear menu, you would see that map option, and you can pick from different tables, and this is an automatically populated menu. If the names are different, then you won't see that menu populated automatically, but you can go to the other drop-down menu, and the type of column that is being used here is a column called map, where if I select the map column, then I get this mapping interface. Now, this can actually be used in a number of different ways. I illustrated it here, connecting 2 different data sets, but you can also have within this column itself, I could map, for example, basically specifying the mapping method, where I would say from number to text, I could have from 1 to A, and I could again map the part column here so that I don't necessarily have to have that mapping in another column. You can create within a data set a column that will map numerical values to text values. Okay, so that's something to play with. I hope that at least gives you a little bit of an introduction to how that works. I guess just to be clear, if you look underneath the map column that I created with the gear menu, it has a different method. This is the from columns method, where you're picking the key value that you want to map your data to. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of quickly see if I can get through some of the questions that we see here. I think we've gone ahead and answered that. Can I import, sorry, can the import special pay special to existing columns rather than appending to the last column or adding to the mapping functionality? I have to think about the import special, pay special. I have to think about exactly if you can, I think you can map within the import special. I think I'm gonna have to check on that question a little bit and get back to you on that one. Just to comment on updating the YouTube channel, we will work on that. And thank you guys very much for attending. We are just after 12 o'clock, and if there are any quick questions, you can pop them up. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you guys very much for attending. Can you perform any sort of data manipulation while parsing, for example, combining two columns? Well, because the import special actually allows you to specify exactly what the separator is, then you can determine what that, how those columns are parsed. So, and I don't know if I can quickly demonstrate that. If I go into import special again, and I pick this record, then there is a section here where you can say so I'm defining here that I have these columns, but I don't have to have the separator be a comma or a tab. You can match a specific text value, for example. You can specify a fixed width for a column. So if you know that your data is of a fixed width type and you have 15 characters that you want all in the same column, you can do that. And notice how I can use a different separator for each column that I set up. So it's really, again, it's a very powerful way to be able to parse your data and see what this looks like. So for example, here, if I said my column here was all, say, well, actually, I guess I only have one column here, so this isn't really necessarily making a big difference, but you can see how all of the data just get plunked into this one column for part number. So I could do this a number of different ways in order to manipulate how that data is brought in. So you definitely have that functionality of again, specifying what the column separator is and being able to manipulate your data in that way. And I do think there is, I guess I have to check on this specifically. I think there is also a potential to find and replace from within the import special. I haven't used that myself in a while, but I think that might be an option also. I'm going to have to check on that and see if I can remind myself how to use it, because I haven't need to use that in a while. So, okay, I'm going to just go ahead and clear these out. I am going to be posting this video on YouTube. We've been trying to get the videos posted within basically sometime next week, hopefully early next week. We'll have this video out, and we'll have it out before we do the next video, which will be next Friday at the same time. And we're going to really focus again on how you're creating graphs, and particularly from a scientific point of view. So thinking about the types of graphs and publication quality graphs that typically go into scientific publications. We'll show you some examples of what graphs that we know our users have created in different publications, so you can get a sense of what other people are doing, and then hopefully help you so you can use DataGraph for your publications. So thank you very much for participating. And of course, any follow-up questions, you can post them on our message board on the forum, or contact us at help@visualdatatools.com. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And again, thanks for attending.